we're living in an end of our world situation. Now a general strengthening of denial about the risk of planetary catastrophe, irreversible, brought about by literally the explosive amounts of emissions that are going into the oceans in particular. And when you look at atmospheric CO2 concentration, but also global warming, when you look at those over a period of just 500 years, it's an explosive increase.
Hello, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Charles, and I'll be your host. Today, we'll be discussing Doomsday Clock Update 2024, which comes from a group known as the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. It is a non-profit organization concerning science and global security issues resulting from accelerating technological advances that have negative consequences for humanity, such as, for example, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, climate change, and now more recently, artificial intelligence. The Bulletin publishes content at both a free access website as well as a non-technical academic journal. We will include these links in the description. The Bulletin has been publishing continuously since 1945, when it was founded by Albert Einstein and former Manhattan Project scientists as the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists of Chicago. This happened immediately following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The organization is also the keeper of the symbolic, or metaphoric, if you will, Doomsday Clock, the time of which is announced each January. And this year, the clock remains at 90 seconds to midnight. Now, Peter and Paul will be discussing and covering many of the factors contributing to this in more detail. In 1945, the public interest in atomic warfare and weaponry inspired contributors to the Bulletin to attempt to inform those interested about the dangers of the nuclear arms race they knew was coming and about the destruction that atomic war could bring about. With that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Peter. Peter, what can you share with us today about the 2024 statement?
So they're 90 seconds to midnight, the closest, as you say, it has ever been, is very accurate. They added the climate change emergency a few years ago to the nuclear situation. They do two, well, at least two. They do two background statements, infos, and they're both very good. They're very good on the fact that the hostility between the great powers that own most of the nuclear weapons. The United States and the Russian Federation owns about 90% of the nuclear weapons of the warheads. So they mention, which I've mentioned a couple of times before, the fact that there's more conflict, including state-to-state conflict in the world today than there has ever been since the end of the Second World War. And of course, we have two horrible ongoing warring situations, I guess you call them, Ukraine, and also, of course, this absolutely unbelievable, terrible thing, which is happening with the Israeli armed forces invasion of Gaza. I should say that quite rightly, the media has said that what's happening there at least rivals and maybe even worse in the compressed period of time in the destruction that's being wrought onto Gaza and the deaths of civilians. which is occurring as a result. It's a really shameful situation. Absolutely terrible. But all of these hostilities in the world, and there are many, many more around the world, increase the risk of a nuclear weapon being set off. And the bulletin mentions, that this might be an accidental thing. And we know when the Cold War was ongoing and the peace movement was working hard to contain the danger of nuclear war wiping us all out. We know now in retrospect that at least three times that I recall, we came very, very close to an accidental unleashing of these weapons. The policy at the time was called mutually assured destruction, MAD, and we're still in an absolutely insane situation with all these weapons, but also with regards to the amount of modern, I guess you'd call, heavy weaponry in the world. I mean, it's increasing and increasing and increasing all the time. The military expenditures on armaments are at an all-time high. Stockholm Peace Institute does that every year, and they're now up to, I think it's $2.2 trillion a year. I mean, you can just say from that the seems to be that the main activity, the main business, the main purpose of nations, of countries, is they call it defense, but it's ramping up more and more and more weapons and worse and worse and worse weapons. So I think that regards the bulletin, yeah, we're in a worse situation. It's not me that's saying this. Several other observers have said it, that this is a worse situation than actually in the Cold War between the US and Russia. And I guess I'll just say one thing about the climate aspect. It is called the Doomsday Clock. And several of the leading well-known climate experts have been putting out messages that it's a thoroughly bad thing to talk about doomsday or doomist situations with regards to climate change. I was really shocked about that. They even went so far as to saying that people who are portraying a doom risk with regards to climate change are actually doing more damage than the professional so-called deniers. So I was pretty shocked and actually offended by that. And the point is that we have created a situation of doom with regards to our emissions, with regards to our policies, a situation of doom onto today's children and all future generations. I mean, that's the point. And to say that people who are studying and following and know about climate change should not treat it as a dangerous to doom situation, that's quite wrong. It's almost practically impossible to overstate the danger that the entire world is in with regards to an atmosphere being filled up more and more and more with heat retaining greenhouse gases. Everything's accelerating. My final point on that would be that just for the last year of CO2 emissions has been a record increase. So it's a big record increase of the emissions and the atmospheric CO2 concentration reported by NOAA for January this year compared to January last year. So in both cases, in our war and weaponry and in our refusal to do anything but increase emissions, we're in definitely a future that we should seriously consider could be described as a doomed future.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing that and very interesting points about the heavy weaponry augmenting annually. And so that's, I think, very important. Of course, many other points you brought up, so that's great. So now I would like to ask Paul for his contribution to this discussion.
Yes, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Peter. And I completely echo your disgust at some well-publicized climate scientists who say people talking about doom are doing more disservice than climate deniers. I mean, that's just idiotic statements. And these people have, they should know better. They should, they're stepping out of their alley to say that sort of thing. They know nothing about human psychology. They're in very specialized fields, and I don't need to mention any particular names here. So the bulletin, the group is very, this is a very useful group, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It's got a very important history, the founding history, and many people have seen the recent Hollywood blockbuster Oppenheimer, which goes into the development of the bomb in very good detail. It's important to remind people of the power of these nuclear weapons. And when we have an ongoing war with Russia, invading the Ukraine, and we have continuous upgrades to nuclear weapons from the US and Russia. And people forget that if there was a nuclear exchange, it's not the radiation and explosions that are going to kill people. It's the so-called nuclear winter, which is a very good phrase. A nuclear exchange, even a limited exchange, would create enough ash and soot particles in the atmosphere to block out the sun for several years, wiping out global food production, crops, and so on, causing mass starvation. And it's a mass starvation that would kill the vast majority of people from a nuclear exchange. So people need to remember that, even, 5 of the top most powerful explosives that are in the arsenals of Russia, China, the USA, even 5 being detonated could probably cause this nuclear winter. Or an exchange, say, between India and Pakistan could also do the same sort of thing. So quite rightly, 90 seconds to midnight is what the Doomsday Clock is indicating. So it started off with the nuclear threat, but the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is also, they're very concerned about other technologies, as Peter's mentioned. Like any disruptive technology acceleration, they're concerned about. Also, the government's feeble efforts to control them. So, basically in 2019, the Doomsday Clock was set at 2 minutes to midnight. By 2022, it was 100 seconds to midnight. Pandemics weighed in, as well as global conflicts. And in 2023, it went to 90 seconds for the first time. That's the closest yet. And that was because of Russian nuclear threats. And, some Russian leaders threatened to use nuclear bombs. And, if they ended up being, on the losing side of their excursion into the Ukraine, they threatened to use these limited nuclear weapons. And we've developed tactical nuclear weapons. So, the arms treaties like START, which is a strategic arms reduction treaty, that is, we've kind of lost the communication between Russia and the West. So Russia's pulled out of these treaties, as the US, and there is a proliferation more of smaller so-called battlefield tactical nukes, which are of the, yield of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're not on the same level as the 1,000 times stronger H bombs, but so we're definitely, in a precarious world situation, which is what the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is relaying with their Doomsday Clock at 90 seconds.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, I think I suspect another factor influencing their reasoning on setting the time of the clock is perhaps 2023 was the hottest year on record, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah, we're setting all kinds of records climate-wise. 2023 was 1.5 Celsius. People need to remember that only 1% of the global heating on the planet is heating of the atmosphere. Over 90% is heating of the oceans, and we're getting record warm ocean temperatures, which is leading to record intensities of storms, of cyclones / hurricanes / typhoons. So that people are talking about moving to a category 6 or even category 7 scale of these storms. And the biggest threat, I mean, as far as climate, this organization, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, they realize that the nuclear threat is there hanging over us still. It will be as long as there's nuclear weapons on the planet. But what they thought was a slower moving threat, climate change, is they've been talking about, but now they're seeing that it's not actually a slow-moving threat. It's with us now, and it's rapidly advancing, and it threatens the global food supply, actually. And they talk about an increase in floods and wildfires and droughts in other regions and heat waves and stuff. And just today, I mean, open the news and look at the massive floods in California, 1 in 1,000 year flooding all along the coastline of California from atmospheric rivers hitting. Look at the tremendous heat in the southern hemisphere, partly the result of all the missing Antarctic sea ice and the drying and wildfires that we're seeing in Chile, which they haven't had before to this extent, killing several hundred people, it looks like, destroying thousands of structures. So we're having a lot of climate mayhem around the world, and a lot of different groups and organizations are trying to communicate this risk to the public and to the politicians, and using things like the Doomsday Clock, is a good way for them to try to do that, I think.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. And Peter, I'm going to turn back to you. Do you have anything you'd like to add to this discussion regarding the 2024 Doomsday news?
The media quite reasonably keeps us informed and keeps us linked to the present time. And we really should be thinking way more about our future and way more about the future of all today's children and all the other creatures and populations on the planet. So, as you know, I follow the climate indicators on a regular basis and periodically present those at science conferences. There's a lot of these indicators. They're all at record high, which is record bad, and that is record catastrophically dangerous. And they're all increasing faster than ever. I've just mentioned atmospheric CO2 concentration, which is increasing faster than it ever has, ever has. We need to think about, okay, so what happens to the future if this just carries on like that? Well, you could almost say, I would anyway, that we're sort of watching the future disappear before our very eyes. Certainly I am, following all of these climate change indicators, as I say. And there's no question at all that from now on, people surely can appreciate that the extreme weather events are going to continue to get more and more extreme, that is, more severe. And the majority of them, there's going to be an increase in frequency, particularly on heat waves for sure, and also on drought as well. So the planet is being literally ravaged by our greenhouse gas emissions. And there seems to be, well, there's certainly no intention on the part of politicians, leaders of any kind, to really call a complete stop to that. The situation is not being communicated. It is not being described. We're living in an end of our world situation. But the trouble about that is we're in denial of it. There's now a general strengthening of denial about the risk of planetary catastrophe, irreversible, brought about by literally the explosive amounts of emissions that are going into the oceans in particular. And when you look at atmospheric CO2 concentration, but also global warming, when you look at those over a period of just 500 years, it's an explosive increase, which is ratcheting up and up and up and up. So there should be red alarm bells ringing. And my hope has always been that the scientists would sound the alarm very, very strongly and communicate this to their governments. And basically, my hope was the scientists would demand an emergency response. I mean, they know what has to be done. A few of the scientific papers and a few of the scientists now, World Meteorological Organization, for example, what they're saying is we are now in uncharted territory. I mean, I don't think that's very instructive. I mean, I don't think it's descriptive. I mean, I don't think anybody is going to take away the fact that we are on the road to climate breakdown, and we're on the road to an irreversible situation of which is completely uncontrollable by us, of feedbacks, amplifying feedbacks, weakening of the carbon sinks. I don't think saying we're in uncharted territory really does anything very much at all to communicate that. I'd like our leaders and our leading scientists to be much more clear and definite about what their research, what their findings, which are amazing, really, really mean for us.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, uncharted territories is a ridiculous statement. It's we all like to explore and it sounds exciting, It's what Shackleton did and the other great polar explorers did at the turn of the last century. Explore uncharted lands and huge adventure story. Well, we're not in uncharted territory. We're heading to climate catastrophe. Just look at some of James Hansen's work up until 2010. We're global temperatures in the atmosphere were rising about 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. And, we've accelerated to a band of between 0.27 to 0.36 degrees Celsius. And, his climate sensitivity number of 4.8 Celsius for a doubling of CO2 that has large error bands. It could be as high as 6 degrees Celsius. So we're heading to climate catastrophe. We're heading to a collapsed global food supply and mass starvation and death. That's not uncharted at all. I mean, so, the Stockholm Institute does very good work in setting up what they're calling their planetary boundaries, these boundaries and different parameters that we must not spend time over. If we've crossed, we have to try to crawl our way back to within a safe threshold. So they're talking about it's sort of like their version of the Doomsday Clock, only they're holding it for many different Earth elements and parameters. And also the Bulletin people, they have a science and security board that sets the Doomsday Clock. They also talk about the risks from genetic engineering. And I don't think it's come out definitively one way or the other, what the origin of the COVID virus was. Was it just something that came from poultry in animal farms, or did it come out of some lab? I don't know if anybody knows for sure the answer to that. I mean, genetic engineering has been, people are working on new types of viruses that can't be fought with known medicines and things. And there's also, a real big unknown, I think, is in something called long COVID, which governments are trying to downplay, but cancer rates are on the rise and more people are dying, young people dying of heart attacks and things. And we know COVID can really, multiple COVID exposures can really wreak havoc on the immune system and cardiovascular systems and so on. Also, I mean, the risks of AI, we've all seen generative AI like Chat GPTs, different variants, the ability to generate fake videos, to fake voices, to fake persona saying things, is being news stories. But we have, many countries around the world are in an election year. And a lot of people are very concerned about the use of AI in nefarious ways to subvert democracy. I think it is a big risk that we're on our way to possibly losing democracy in the US. And I think that's a huge global risk since the US has such tremendous power and sway in the world and has basically an unmatched military capability. Although the organization, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, is basically a US-based organization, I think that they're not mentioning US democracy threats and challenges. I think that's just, it's an oversight on their part. They're a US organization. I don't think that they recognize the big threats within the US itself. I would say that that's a big threat, probably the biggest that they didn't mention in their report, the failure of US democracy.
Thank you for adding the point about the U.S. democracy, Paul. Yeah, I think that could be a huge kind of unquantifiable risk, but definitely potentially a big risk. I guess the other thing too that strikes me is this whole idea too that's being talked about more and more, this idea of climate restoration versus greenhouse gas emissions. and the risk of the existing emissions that are already in the atmosphere versus the emissions we continue to spew out. And that seems to be a topic that's coming up more and more, which we'll be covering in future episodes of the Climate Emergency Forum.
So I guess I'll make a quick summary from my point of view. In my entire lifetime, we have been under, the world's been under a state of peril due to the presence of nuclear weapons. And today, the Bulletin tells us that there's more research into all of the countries into developing what to me are worse nuclear weapons, what to them are better nuclear weapons. And then if we look at what I've just mentioned about the climate change and the climate indicators, one has to wonder who we are. Hmm? You know, what is our politics? What is our worldview? What is our idea about economics? Because the conclusion that I come to is that our our way of life, our view, particularly our economics, is inherently a destructive one. I think the mutually assured destruction is still in operation. And I think the situation of basically doing worse than nothing for weapons and war, and also doing worse than nothing on our emissions and climate disruption, it's like a global insanity to me. It really, really is. I mean, there's nothing rational here. I mean, you can't come up with any reason why everything is getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, there just isn't any except who we are, right? And our system is certainly one I think of. It's an absolutely crazy system in which the world is being led and managed.
Very profound. Thanks, Peter.
So we thank you for joining us here today. And if you learned something from this video, please consider liking the video. And if you haven't done so already, subscribing. And so we look forward to seeing you again on the next Climate Emergency Forum.